He screamed in pain. His arm was broken. The cop thought he would get away with it until his mother showed up. Subscribe to new stories and write in the comments where you are watching us from. The morning sunlight over Solana Beach was soft and golden, stretching across the manicured lawns and calm sidewalks of suburban San Diego like a silent promise. Birds chirped lazily, and the scent of freshly mowed grass floated on the breeze. It was the kind of morning that made one believe in the safety of routine and the dull comfort of repetition. For most residents, this Saturday morning was no different than the one before or the one that would come after. But for one boy, it would mark the dividing line between innocence and injustice, trust and betrayal. 11-year-old Michael Rousey walked alone along the edge of Las Palmas Avenue, his small frame casting a long shadow on the sunlit concrete. Dressed in his Rousey MMA Academy training shirt and gray sweatpants, his gym bag slung across his shoulder, he looked like any other disciplined, athletic kid walking home from practice. His breathing was steady, his pace relaxed. His mother, Ronda, had insisted that he begin walking home sometimes, just 2 miles, from the academy to build independence, awareness, and humility. No security details, no tinted cars, just a boy and the street. He liked it that way. He liked being unseen, unknown. Michael wasn't one to seek attention. Despite being the only son of one of the most formidable women in modern sports history, he had inherited Ronda's quiet discipline more than her fire. He loved anatomy books and sketching. He often said he wanted to be a doctor, not a fighter, even though his form in the ring was sharper than most kids twice his age. Ronda didn't push him toward the cage. She merely insisted he know how to stand up, when and how and to whom. As he approached the final intersection before their neighborhood cul-de-sac, Michael noticed the white and black shape of a San Diego police cruiser parked lazily by the curb. He paid it no mind at first. It was just there, a familiar part of city life. He adjusted the strap on his bag and kept walking, his eyes on the sidewalk. Then the cruiser pulled forward slowly, engine rumbling low. It crept alongside him, tires crunching against loose gravel. The window rolled down. "Hey, you!" The voice was deep and curt, sharp like a whip crack. Michael turned. A white officer, broad-chested with pale gray eyes, peered out from behind mirrored sunglasses. His nameplate read, T. Kessington. "You live around here?" the officer asked. His voice carried that practiced authority tinged with suspicion, less question, more accusation. Michael nodded politely. "Yes, sir, just 2 blocks that way." Kessington didn't move. "You got ID?" Michael hesitated, startled by the question. "I'm 11, he replied, brows knitting in confusion. "I don't carry. Don't get smart," the officer snapped, already opening the door. His boots hit the pavement with a heavy thud. The boy stepped back instinctively, unsure. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He hadn't run, shouted, or disrespected. He had only answered honestly. But Kessington was already walking toward him with purposeful strides, one hand on his belt, the other gesturing. "What's in the bag?" "Just my gym stuff," Michael answered quickly, holding it out. "I just came from Rousey MMA Academy. My mom owns—" "You think name-dropping's gonna help you?" Kessington growled. He was close now, towering. "Gimme the bag." Michael handed it over. The officer unzipped it roughly, sifting through wraps, gloves, and a water bottle before tossing it onto the sidewalk. The water bottle rolled toward the gutter. "I didn't do anything," Michael said softly, his voice tightening with anxiety. "I promise." "Put your hands behind your back," came the sudden order. "What? Why?" "Now." Michael raised his hands slowly, confused, trembling. As he turned, Kessington yanked one arm down and twisted it behind his back with a force far beyond what was necessary. The boy gasped. Then came the sound, quiet but unmistakable. A sharp crack. Pain exploded through Michael's arm like electricity. His knees buckled, his eyes widened, his voice caught in his throat before erupting into a scream. "Stop! Stop! It hurts!" he cried out, collapsing onto one knee, cradling his now limp arm against his chest. The limb hung awkwardly, the bone clearly dislocated or worse. "That's what happens when you get mouthy," Kessington muttered, breathing heavy, sweat glinting on his brow. He looked down at the boy like he was trash. Michael was sobbing now, not from fear, but from betrayal. "I didn't do anything," he whispered through clenched teeth, over and over again. A red light blinked on the inside of his wristband, barely noticeable. Kessington didn't see it. With a final look around, perhaps noticing a window curtain shift in the distance, he backed off. He didn't call it in. He didn't wait for backup. He got in his cruiser, slammed the door, and peeled off down the street, leaving a broken child on the pavement, his gym bag spilling across the sidewalk, his water bottle in the gutter. Several houses down, a woman watering her lawn dropped her hose. Another man stepped out from a garage, phone already recording. Someone shouted, "Is he okay?" And another yelled, "Call 911." But Michael couldn't answer. He curled into himself, cradling his ruined arm, gasping for breath. The blinking red light continued to pulse, silent, efficient, a signal, a code only one person in the city recognized. Back at Rousey MMA Academy, the alarm buzzed quietly on a private panel mounted inside the front office. It was a custom build, designed by one of Ronda's former teammates and military combatives. Only one device could trigger it. A wristband worn by Michael, programmed to ping location and emergency status if pressed for 3 seconds. Ronda Rousey had just finished going over a list of new students with her head instructor when the light blinked. It was nothing dramatic, just a single flash. She stared at it. The air left the room. She stood up slowly, all motion deliberate, like the silence before a storm. "What is it?" her instructor asked. "Michael," she said, already grabbing her phone. She pulled up the tracker app. His location appeared on a map, static and unmoving, halfway between the academy and home. Her fingers flew across the screen. No response from his phone. No signal except the emergency ping. She didn't speak again. She just turned, grabbed her keys, and ran. Traffic lights blurred. Horns sounded but were ignored. Her car flew down the 5 with a singular focus. Her mind was steel, but her heart raced against her ribs like a prisoner. By the time she reached the location, a small crowd had gathered. A paramedic was kneeling beside Michael, gently securing a temporary splint to his clearly broken arm. His face was pale and his eyes were glassy with pain, but he was conscious. When Ronda burst through the line of onlookers, no one stopped her. One look at her face, calm but lethal, was enough. "Mom," Michael whispered when he saw her. His voice cracked. "He said he didn't care who you were." The pain in his words was sharper than any scream. Ronda dropped beside him. She didn't cry. She didn't ask who. She already knew. She only asked, "Did you press the button?" He nodded. "That's all I need," she whispered. The EMTs lifted him into the ambulance. Ronda stayed back just long enough to thank the bystanders and shake the hand of the woman who had filmed the incident. "Send that video to this number," she said, writing on the woman's arm with a pen from her glove box. Then she stepped into her car. Her son was hurt. Her trust was broken. And whoever did this, Whoever thought they could hurt a child and walk away had no idea what kind of reckoning they had just set in motion, because Ronda Rousey had just stepped into a different kind of cage, and this time she wasn't fighting for a title. She was fighting for blood. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the emergency room with a quiet buzz that did nothing to dull the sharp edges of anxiety radiating from Ronda as she paced the narrow hallway. Outside the trauma bay, beyond the glass pane and closed curtain, her son lay on a white hospital bed with his arm elevated, an oxygen sensor clipped to one small finger, a temporary brace holding the limb in place until they could wheel him into radiology. She had followed the ambulance in her own vehicle, unwilling to leave her son, but not about to be passive either. The EMTs had been professional and kind, but none of them could answer the only question that pulsed like a drumbeat in her head. Who? Ronda had seen many kinds of injuries in her life: clean breaks, spiral fractures, dislocations, internal bruising. This one wasn't accidental. It wasn't a child who tripped and landed wrong. The angle of the limb, the external damage, and the position of the bruises made it clear. Someone had twisted it with force. The thought made her stomach turn. She'd spent a lifetime learning to use her body as a weapon, but that knowledge made it all the more unbearable to imagine someone using theirs against her son. A nurse stepped out from behind the curtain with a clipboard and a weary expression. "He's stable," she said softly. "They're prepping him for X-ray. His pain level is high, but he's lucid. He keeps saying he didn't do anything wrong." Ronda's jaw clenched, her eyes narrowing. "He didn't," she replied, her voice like ice cracking. "I believe you," the nurse added, then lowered her voice. "We've had these cases before. No one ever wants to say it out loud, but—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. "I want a copy of everything," Ronda said, already pulling out a notepad. "The admitting log, the name of the EMT team, any body cam footage if it exists. And I want the name of the officer who brought him in, if any." The nurse hesitated. There was no officer. Ronda blinked. "What do you mean?" "The ambulance was called by bystanders. They said the officer just drove off." For a moment, Ronda couldn't speak. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. The rage was no longer something beneath the surface. It was molten, ready to erupt. A police officer had assaulted her son and left him like garbage on a sidewalk. The nurse laid a gentle hand on Ronda's arm. "We're going to take good care of him. But if what he's saying is true, you need to report this." "I'm going to do more than that," Ronda said, her voice low. Minutes later, she stood at Michael's bedside. His face was pale, the pain medication only beginning to kick in. He looked at her with eyes that still held fear. That hurt more than anything. "He was a cop," he whispered. "I told him who you were. He laughed." Ronda sat beside him and placed a hand on his uninjured shoulder. "You did the right thing." "I pressed the button like you said," he murmured. She smiled faintly, brushing hair from his forehead. "That button just saved everything." Michael looked confused. "But he's gone." "No," she said quietly. "He's not gone. He just made a mistake he'll never recover from." When Michael was taken for X-rays, Ronda stepped out of the room and pulled out her phone. She made 4 calls in rapid succession. The first was to her longtime lawyer, Madison Grant, a hardline civil attorney known for her pit bull approach to police misconduct cases. The second went to Josie King, a respected investigative reporter at ESPN who owed Ronda a favor after the fighter had once saved her career from a tabloid scandal. The third was to Diego "Ghost" Ramirez, a former Marine and LAPD officer turned private security consultant. He had left the force after refusing to bury a complaint about excessive force. The fourth call was silent. Ronda didn't even say a word, just sent a single red exclamation point to a private group chat with her training partners and inner circle. Within seconds, responses began to pour in. What happened? Where? Who hurt him? By the time Michael returned from radiology, Ronda had already established the framework of a counteroffensive. She'd been on the receiving end of injustice before. She'd been told to stay quiet, to let it go. Not this time. Later that evening, while her son slept sedated and wrapped in sterile bandages and gentle whispers from kind nurses, Ronda sat in the waiting area of the hospital, reviewing every bit of information she could gather. A bystander had sent her a shaky video of the incident. It was grainy but damning, enough to show the officer's face, the use of force, and the moment Michael hit the pavement. The clip had already been viewed thousands of times online, but it hadn't yet gone viral. Ronda knew that would change. She opened her social media accounts, uploaded the video with the caption, "This is my son. He was walking home. A police officer broke his arm. We will not stay silent." Within 5 minutes, it had over 10,000 shares. Within 10, it hit national trending. Messages began flooding in. Some were from fans, some from mothers, some from people who had never even heard of her, but had children of their own. She ignored most of them. Instead, she focused on the incoming reports from Madison and Diego. The name came quickly. Officer Troy Kessington. Assigned to the northern San Diego district, previously suspended without pay 3 years ago for inappropriate conduct during a traffic stop involving a teenage black boy. Cleared internally. 2 other complaints buried. All the signs of a predator protected by a badge. Not this time, Ronda whispered. The next morning, she stood on the steps outside the hospital and gave a short, controlled press statement. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stated facts. My son, Michael Rousey, 11 years old, was assaulted by a police officer while walking home from practice. He was not resisting. He was not armed. He was not doing anything wrong. The officer used unnecessary force, resulting in a broken arm and emotional trauma. This officer has a documented history of excessive force. He was not disciplined. Now, he's hurt my child. I'm calling on the San Diego Police Department to release the body cam footage, the cruiser's dash cam, and all internal records. If they do not, we will obtain them through legal action. This is not about celebrity. This is about accountability. And I will not stop. The video of the press statement circulated alongside the original clip. It went viral. Hashtags formed, #Justice, for Michael, #Ronda Speaks, #Police Brutality has a name. News outlets picked up the story. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox News ran segments. The image of Michael in a hospital bed, holding his mother's hand, his arm in a cast, became a symbol. Inside the San Diego Police Department, chaos brewed. Whispers spread through the hallways. Kessington had taken an unsanctioned patrol route. He hadn't filed a report. No body cam footage had been uploaded. When asked about the incident, he claimed the boy had fallen. No one believed him. The police chief released a generic statement about ongoing investigations and respecting due process. Ronda responded with another public message. Due process wasn't respected when my son was left on the pavement. Meanwhile, Diego traced Kessington's movements. The officer had gone dark, taken sick leave. Rumors swirled that he'd fled town temporarily. But Ronda didn't care how far he ran. She wasn't after vengeance. She was after something deeper, an end to silence. She spent the following days between Michael's bedside and strategic meetings. Madison prepared a civil lawsuit. Josie published an expose detailing Kessington's pattern of abuse. Diego contacted his former colleagues for leads. Protests began forming in front of the police station. Not massive ones yet, but they were growing. College students, mothers, former victims, people who had been waiting for a voice strong enough to draw attention. By the end of the week, Ronda had enough evidence to file official charges and launch a public campaign. Her final act before striking would be finding Kessington's location. That opportunity came with a call from Diego. "He's hiding out at a motel 20 miles north. No cameras, fake name, but I've got confirmation." Ronda nodded slowly, eyes focused, breath calm. "Good. I want to speak to him. Alone." Diego hesitated. "You sure?" "I'm not going to touch him," she said, though the quiet steel in her voice left the statement open to interpretation. She hung up the phone and turned back to Michael, who was watching a cartoon on his tablet with his good hand. "Mom," he said, looking up. "Yeah, baby? Will he go to jail?" Her throat tightened. "He will," she said. "He'll answer for what he did." Michael looked back at the screen and whispered, "Good." Later that night, after he'd fallen asleep, Ronda stepped into the hallway and stood beneath the sterile hospital lights, her fists in her pockets. Her shadow stretched long on the floor beneath her, like something waiting to be unchained. She was ready, not as a fighter, not even as a mother, but as someone who had been pushed 1 inch too far. The motel stood on the outskirts of Escondido, a sun-faded structure flanked by a row of dying palm trees and cracked pavement. The sign buzzed weakly overhead, Vista Pines Inn, its neon letters missing a bulb or two, flickering like the pulse of something waiting to end. Ronda Rousey sat in her car just across the street, engine idling, windows rolled halfway down. Her eyes were fixed on room 12, the blinds drawn tight, a single dented SUV parked outside. The vehicle was registered to a shell company in Anaheim, standard protocol for someone trying to stay off the grid. She had spent the last 48 hours assembling a mosaic of Officer Troy Kessington's life. His patrol routes, disciplinary records, known associates, and now, thanks to Diego Ramirez, his exact location. He hadn't expected the walls to close so fast. He underestimated her. Most people did. They mistook her silence for compliance, but Ronda was never silent. She was simply calculating. She had arrived 20 minutes earlier, parking where she could observe without being seen. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows that wrapped around the building like arms. Her phone buzzed beside her. Diego. The message was short. Still alone, registered under Ty Kent. No signs of movement since this morning. Ronda didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her hands were steady on the steering wheel, her thoughts razor sharp. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about confirmation and control. In the back seat, a folder rested on the seat. Internal affairs summaries, civilian complaint transcripts, a notarized affidavit from a former partner who had once seen Kessington shove a Latino teen against a fence hard enough to draw blood. All swept away under administrative review. Ronda had highlighted each line. She could recite them by heart. She wasn't just coming for him. She was coming for the pattern, for the silence that had allowed him to think he was untouchable. At exactly 6:34 p.m., the door to room 12 creaked open. Kessington emerged, dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, a navy hoodie, ball cap pulled low. He carried a duffel bag over one shoulder and clutched a styrofoam cup of motel coffee in the other. His gait was nervous, too fast, too unsure. His eyes scanned the parking lot with the paranoia of someone who had lost control of the narrative. Ronda slipped out of the car and crossed the street without a sound. Each step was purposeful, her body a model of quiet balance, like a predator tracking prey. He didn't see her until he reached his vehicle and dropped the bag to open the door. By then, it was too late. "You're not going to get far," she said. He flinched, spinning around. For a moment, he didn't recognize her. Then his mouth twitched and she saw the flash of recognition, followed by something uglier. Disdain. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice strained, tight. "This is harassment." "Funny," she replied. "So is breaking a kid's arm." Kessington stepped back, his hand moving slightly toward his waistband. She noticed the twitch instantly. Training. Instinct. Her body shifted before thought could interfere. She closed the distance in a heartbeat, grabbing his wrist, twisting it down and back with calculated precision. The styrofoam cup spilled, burning liquid splashing on the pavement. He gasped, trying to wriggle free, but her grip was iron. "Don't," she warned. "This won't end the way you think." He stumbled, crashing against the side of his SUV. She released him, letting him fall. He hit the ground with a groan, clutching his wrist, glaring up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "You assaulted me," he spat. "No," she said, retrieving the folder from her car. "I stopped you from reaching for a weapon. A reflex you seem to have around black kids." She tossed the folder onto the hood of his car. Papers fanned out, catching the wind. He stared at them but didn't touch. "These are the reports they buried," she said. "The kids no one listened to. The complaints marked her solved without action. The injuries explained away. But this time, you didn't pick a voiceless child. You picked my son." His face twisted. He resisted. "He's 11, Ronda said, her tone flat. "He was walking home. You never even filed a report. You ran." Kessington stood slowly, dusting himself off. "You think you're going to scare me? I've got rights. I've got backup." "You don't have a badge," she said. "Not anymore." He hesitated. "Your department's disavowing you. They've launched a formal review. You're a liability. They'll throw you to the wolves to protect the rest of their machine." He blinked, unsure whether to believe her. "I have everything," she continued. "Video, witnesses, medical reports, my son's emergency bracelet log, and this," she held up a USB drive, "contains everything internal affairs ignored." He stared at the drive like it was a ticking bomb. "You're done, Kessington. There's no redemption arc for you, no quiet resignation, no moving to another precinct. This is the end of the road." He opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to plead, but sirens cut through the silence. 2 squad cars rounded the corner, tires screeching. Ronda stepped back, arms folded as the officers stepped out. They knew who she was. Everyone did by now. "Miss Rousey?" the lead officer asked. She nodded. "He's all yours." Kessington looked at them in disbelief. "She attacked me?" "You were reported missing," the officer replied, "and you're under review for use of excessive force. Please, turn around." He resisted for a moment, reflex, pride, but then the weight of reality settled on his shoulders. He turned, wrists cuffed, head down. As the officers led him away, Ronda remained still. One of the younger officers looked back at her. "My daughter's in the same martial arts program as Michael," he said quietly. "She saw the video. She cried, said it could have been her." Ronda met his gaze. "That's the problem. It could have been anyone. When the cruisers disappeared around the bend, Ronda picked up the scattered papers from the pavement, tucking them back into the folder. The wind had calmed. The sun was nearly gone, leaving behind only the long purple smudge of dusk. She sat in her car and stared ahead, hands resting on the wheel, not moving. Her body ached. Her head throbbed, but her heart was calm. It wasn't over. This was just the arrest. The trial would come. The media storm would build. The department would fight back. But this time they wouldn't be battling a name. They'd be battling a mother, a fighter, a survivor. And behind her, a wave of families, victims, and children who would no longer stay quiet. She drove back to the hospital in silence. Michael was awake when she entered. He looked up, his face still tired, but the fear was gone from his eyes. "Is he gone?" he asked. "Yes," Ronda said. "They took him." "Good," he whispered and drifted back to sleep. Ronda sat beside him, watching the rhythm of his breath. Outside the window, the lights of San Diego sparkled, but inside the room there was only quiet, and the gathering strength of justice long overdue. The morning after Troy Kessington's arrest arrived quietly, as if the sun itself had not yet decided whether to rise in peace or rage. For Ronda, the air was heavy with a strange calm, the kind that came after a storm had passed but before anyone dared to clean up the debris. She sat in the corner of Michael's hospital room, the light from the hallway bleeding in through the crack beneath the door, casting a narrow blade across the floor. Her son was asleep again, breathing softly, his injured arm now encased in a bright blue fiberglass cast covered in signatures from nurses, staff, and even a few kids who had peeked in to leave messages of support. He hadn't asked many questions the night before, and she hadn't offered many answers. He only wanted to know that Kessington was gone, that the man who had twisted his body into pain no child should ever feel was behind bars. And when she said yes, he smiled, a small thing, fragile like sunlight on rain. But it was enough to remind Ronda that every next step had to matter. She stood up slowly, stretching out the tension in her shoulders, and checked her phone. It had been buzzing off and on all night, a relentless stream of messages, emails, missed calls, and news alerts. The arrest video had gone viral. Cell phone footage taken by a neighbor showed Kessington being handcuffed and led into the back of a squad car while Ronda stood still and silent, her face unreadable, the sealed folder pressed against her chest like a final judgment. No words were needed. The image alone became the front page of every major outlet by morning. #Justice for Michael was now a global trend. Celebrities had posted their support. Civil rights attorneys had reached out to her team, some with offers to assist, others with warnings of what would come next. Because the system, Ronda knew, didn't crumble quietly. It pushed back. And already the pushback had begun. The San Diego Police Department released a statement just after midnight. It was carefully worded, devoid of empathy, citing ongoing investigations and a commitment to transparency. But, between the lines, Ronda saw the familiar strategy: delay, discredit, deflect. They wouldn't defend Kessington directly. He was toxic now. But they would protect the uniform, the badge, the machinery that had allowed him to remain in power for so long. There were whispers, too, from sources within the department, claims that Ronda had used force during her confrontation with Kessington, that she had threatened him, that she had taken justice into her own hands. The narrative was forming. She could feel it being stitched together by unseen hands desperate to pull her down. She knew it was coming. She'd seen it before, but she wasn't afraid. Instead, she got dressed in the quiet of the hospital restroom. She didn't wear black or gray. She chose blue jeans, a white-fitted blouse, and a simple navy blazer. Not a fighter's uniform, a citizen's, a mother's. Her hair was pulled back neatly, no trace of adrenaline or rage in her features. She looked like someone ready to speak, but more importantly, someone who had already acted. Downstairs, the hospital lobby was abuzz with reporters. They didn't shout questions this time. They stepped aside when she walked through, parting like water. She didn't look at them. Her eyes were fixed ahead. A car waited at the curb, her lawyer, Madison Grant, at the wheel. Inside, Madison handed her a tablet. The department's officially launched an internal review. Kessington's on unpaid leave, facing charges. But they're not going to let this be clean. They're trying to frame your encounter as vigilante justice. I figured, Ronda replied, scrolling through headlines. That's why I recorded everything. We may need to be proactive, Madison said. Get ahead of the smear campaign. Ronda didn't respond right away. Instead, she watched the city blur past the window as they drove toward the district courthouse. She could feel the momentum shifting, but momentum wasn't justice. Not yet. An hour later, they entered the courthouse side door, bypassing the press swarm. Inside, they met with Assistant District Attorney Carla Jennings, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice like polished steel. She had already reviewed the evidence and agreed to prosecute the case, but her demeanor betrayed caution. You need to understand, Jennings said. We're not just putting one man on trial. We're putting a culture under a microscope. That comes with risk. I'm not afraid of risk, Ronda said, but I'm done with silence. Jennings nodded. Then let's do this right. The charges against Kessington were finalized. Aggravated assault on a minor, abuse of authority, obstruction of justice. He would be arraigned within the week. The case would proceed to trial. And with that, the first real crack in the wall began to spread. Later that day, Ronda stood before a packed gymnasium at a community forum organized by local activists. She hadn't planned to speak, but when she saw the rows of parents holding photos of children, some injured, some gone, her feet moved of their own accord. She stepped to the microphone, the gym fallen into hush. My name is Ronda Rousey. Most people know me from fighting, but today I'm here as a mother. My son was walking home when a man in uniform broke his arm and left him on the street. That man thought he could get away with it. He thought, like so many before him, that no one would hold him accountable. But he was wrong. She paused, eyes sweeping the room. He was wrong because my son had a name. He had a mother. He had people who wouldn't let him be another file in a drawer. But what about the kids who didn't? What about the families who didn't have a camera or a platform? This isn't just about my son. This is about every family that's been told their pain doesn't matter. Every parent who's been forced to bury their child while the person responsible keeps their badge. The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. I'm not asking for pity. I'm not asking for outrage. I'm demanding action. We don't need another round table. We need results, and I intend to get them. Applause erupted, not the kind born of spectacle, but of shared fury, shared hope. In the days that followed, Ronda began organizing. With the help of her team, she launched a national foundation, SHIELD, the Rousey Initiative for Youth Legal Defense, a network designed to provide legal support, emergency resources, and media advocacy for families affected by police violence. Donations poured in. Volunteers stepped up. The infrastructure of something powerful began to take shape. But with visibility came consequence. One morning, just before sunrise, Ronda was awakened by a phone call. Diego's voice was calm but clipped. "You've been flagged." "What do you mean?" "The department's initiated a review of your foundation. They're trying to paint it as a front. There's talk of federal inquiries." Ronda sat up, the room suddenly colder. "Let them come." "They will, and they won't come quietly." Sure enough, the very next day, an article appeared in a fringe publication accusing Ronda of inciting violence, of radicalizing youth, of staging her son's injury for political gain. It was laughable, easily disprovable, but it was the opening salvo of a broader attack. She called a press conference that afternoon. Standing in front of a banner for her foundation, with Michael beside her, she addressed the cameras with unwavering clarity. "They're afraid, not of me, not of my foundation. They're afraid of change, of the world we're building, where no child has to beg for mercy from someone sworn to protect them. But let me be clear, we're not going anywhere. You can slander me. You can investigate me. But you cannot silence me." Michael looked up at her, his unbroken hand gripping hers. That night, the Foundation's website crashed under the weight of visitors. Messages poured in. Stories, cries for help, declarations of solidarity. The movement was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had been bruised and broken and told to forget. In a room dimly lit by her laptop screen, Ronda read through each submission. Some were just names. Some came with photos. Some were just one sentence. "Thank you for speaking when no one listened." She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The courthouse loomed in pale gray against the morning sky, tall and indifferent, a monolith of order that so often preserved silence rather than truth. Ronda Rousey stood on its steps with her hands clasped in front of her, her blazer buttoned, her chin slightly lifted. She hadn't slept much the night before. Michael had tossed in his bed, murmuring in his sleep, reliving shadows she could not pull from his mind. The cast on his arm had started to itch, and though he didn't complain, Ronda could see how it gnawed at him, just like the questions he no longer asked. Questions he feared didn't have answers. Behind her, the crowd swelled. Some were local supporters, others were national activists, and many were just people who had watched the story unfold and could no longer stand by. There were posters and placards, handmade signs that read, "Protect kids, not badges," and "Justice for Michael." The air was thick with anticipation. For once, the eyes of the nation were fixed not on a cage or a ring, but on a courtroom door where one man would answer for what others before him never had. Inside, the courtroom was cool and sterile, the kind of place that attempted to neutralize emotion by stripping it from the walls. Pale oak benches. A judge's bench that sat high above the gallery, like a throne behind which no pain could reach. Reporters had filled every inch of the press section. Civil rights attorneys sat beside trauma counselors and social workers, and in the first row behind the plaintiff's table sat Ronda, Michael, and Madison Grant. Michael wore a pale blue button-up and dark slacks. His cast had been changed to a sleek black brace that fit tightly around his forearm. He sat straight, quiet, but his eyes were alert, searching, aware. Across from them at the defense table, Troy Kessington looked nothing like the man who had once stood smug in uniform. He had lost weight, his suit slightly ill-fitting, his skin sallow, his eyes darting from one end of the courtroom to the other as if scanning for escape. His lawyers sat beside him, stoic and immovable, whispering occasionally with the practiced restraint of men who had defended worse. The judge entered. Everyone stood. A gavel struck wood, sharp and final. What followed was 8 days of relentless testimony. The prosecution opened with the emergency call log from Michael's bracelet, time-stamped, GPS-tracked, irreversible. Then came the hospital records. Digital x-rays showing the fracture, the pattern of bruising consistent with torque, not impact. The treating physician testified next, explaining in medical detail how the injury could only have occurred from deliberate force. Photos of Michael's arm, pale and swollen, were projected onto a screen so large that the audience audibly gasped. Then came the videos. Footage from the bystanders, from the arrest, from Ronda's press conferences. A compilation built with surgical care by Madison's team. Every frame mattered. Every voice was allowed to echo. Ronda took the stand on day 3. She spoke calmly, clearly, without theatrics. She described the moment she received the emergency signal, the hospital, her son's whispered words, the encounter with Kessington. She described every moment with the control of a fighter and the heart of a mother. And when the defense attempted to rattle her with accusations of aggression, she met their questions with precise responses and unshakable composure. "I didn't punch him because I lost control," she said, her voice steady. "I restrained a man reaching for a weapon. I de-escalated a situation that would have ended far worse if I hadn't been trained. I acted, not in anger, but because I saw a man who thought he could hurt a child and walk away. I wasn't going to let him." The courtroom didn't move. The defense tried to push the idea that Michael had exaggerated, that he resisted, that the officer had reason to fear. But the evidence was against them. The bystanders testified. The nurse who treated Michael described his panic, his repeated mantra, "I didn't do anything." The paramedic confirmed the absence of a police report. The internal affairs officer admitted the lack of body cam footage and the administrative irregularities in Kessington's past complaints. And then came the final witness, Michael himself. The judge asked if he was ready. Madison knelt beside him, whispered something soft. Ronda placed her hand on his back. Michael nodded. He walked to the stand slowly, brace visible, his face pale but determined. He was sworn in. He looked up at the courtroom, and he began. "He asked me for ID," Michael said. "But I'm 11. I told him that. I told him my name. I told him who my mom was." He laughed. Then he grabbed my wrist and twisted it. I heard it crack. He paused, and for a moment it seemed he might falter, but he didn't. He didn't care who I was. He didn't even care that I was just a kid. He reached into the folder Madison had handed him earlier. He pulled out a drawing he'd made in the hospital. A little boy with a cast stood at the center, surrounded by people, some with signs, some holding phones, some just standing close. And at the top, in capital letters, he'd written, "I'm not afraid anymore." There wasn't a sound in the courtroom. The judge nodded. The defense didn't cross-examine. After 8 days, the jury withdrew. They returned after just over 6 hours. The verdict was read with no drama, but the air trembled. On the count of aggravated assault on a minor, guilty. On the count of abuse of authority, guilty. On the count of attempted evasion of justice, guilty. Troy Kessington didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He didn't plead. But he didn't look at Ronda or Michael. Not once. He was remanded into custody immediately. The sentence would come later, but the damage was already done. His badge was gone. His name would be recorded in court transcripts forever. And the system that had protected him for so long now bore a crack wide enough for the world to see through. Outside, the courthouse steps had filled again. When Ronda, Michael, and Madison emerged, the crowd broke into applause. They didn't cheer like fans in an arena. They stood in respect, quiet, powerful. One reporter shouted, "What happens now?" Ronda paused, looked down at her son, then looked back at the cameras. "Now," she said, "we make sure it never happens again." And then they walked, not as victims or fighters, but as a family leading a movement. 3 weeks later, there was no celebration. There was work. The Shield Foundation had grown into a national network. Offices had opened in 15 cities. Legal teams were reviewing hundreds of old cases. Thousands of families were finally being heard. Michael returned to school with a new cast and a new sense of belonging. His classmates welcomed him not with questions but with understanding. His drawing, now framed, hung in the principal's office. One evening, he asked Ronda if he could learn how to use his left arm for training. She smiled and said, "Of course. You're not just strong because of your muscles." They trained together under the evening sun. Each strike, each breath, each movement not just a reminder of resilience, but of revolution. And somewhere, far from cameras, far from microphones, Ronda sat alone with the letters she had received from mothers and fathers across the country. She read them all. And then she began to write back. Because this wasn't just about her son. This was about all of them, and her voice, unbreakable, was only just beginning. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next video to see what happens when silence meets resistance, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.